Now I'd like briefly to go back to chapter 12. Chapter 12 is largely a record of the priests and Levites at the time, but also of the dedication of the walls at Jerusalem. And hopefully I won't spend too long, but it would be wrong to miss it out. The opening part is a list, firstly, of the high priests, the priests that came with Zerubbabel, 22 priests of a possible 24 lines of priests, originally from when they were in the land before the captivity. And then, and with them, the details of the Levites. And then from verse 10, 20 children of the 22, again to keep a record of the priesthood. From now on, there will be no king, and the historical seasons and times will be recorded in the sense of when so-and-so was the high priest, the chief priest, but also possibly to record their names as those who had returned to re-establish the worship of God in Jerusalem, no doubt at cost to themselves and at an activity of faith, and that the Lord would have their names ultimately to be recorded. And it goes on just towards the end of the Levites, but mentions the different following the high priests following on, verse 22. The Levites in the days of Eliashib, Joiada, and Johanan, and Jaddua were recorded chief of the fathers, also the priests to the reign of Darius the Persian. Now some have suggested that Jaddua here is the high priest of the same name who met Alexander the Great in roughly 330 BC. And very interesting meeting. I don't think it probably is that one, because there is roughly 100 years between the close of Nehemiah and Alexander the Great coming to Jerusalem. But I just mention it as of interest because this particular Jaddua, the high priest, it was said that Alexander was coming to destroy Jerusalem, but beforehand he saw in a dream what turned out to be the priest coming out to meet him, and Jaddua showed him the prophecies of Daniel, essentially foretelling what he was now doing, conquering the Persian Empire. And understandably, he was favorably inclined to spare the city, to spare Jerusalem. But we have this record here, again, part of the history, the record. There's one little point. It mentions in verse 4 Abijah, one of the lines of the priests, and his line was eventually the one to whom was born Zechariah, John the Baptist's father, that is, and his name is mentioned in Luke. But then from verse 27, the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem. They have built it. One might say there is no command to dedicate the wall, but in the sense that we may dedicate all things to the Lord. We may, in one sense, by faith, dedicate our houses, our cars, our lives to the Lord. They felt it right, in one sense, to acknowledge the Lord's hand in their building, but also to dedicate them to the Lord. Jerusalem, in one sense, a holy city, city of Zion, where the Lord would be within the temple, and they would have the walls as well dedicated to him. And they have this joyful method of having the singers and the musicians from the Levites gathering together with the priests, and the priests on the trumpets, and all gathering from the villages and so on around about Jerusalem, and gathering themselves together. Verse 29, also from the house of Gilgal and out of the fields of Geba and Asmaveth, for the singers had builded them villages round about Jerusalem. And the priests and the Levites purified themselves and purified the people and the gates and the wall. Then I brought up the princes of Judah upon the wall, and appointed 2 great companies of them that gave thanks, whereof one went on the right hand upon the wall toward the dung gate. One went one way round, and another went the other way round, if I've got it right. Both significant numbers with singers and musicians, with the nobility and the significant people of note, and possibly others following within the city walls, and all coming to meet by the temple to give thanks and to dedicate the walls to the Lord by their worship. And we read verse 43, also that day they offered great sacrifices and rejoiced, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The wives also and the children rejoiced, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard even afar off, that it was so loud that it was heard a long way away, encouraging us in our own worship to make a joyful noise unto the Lord, not to shout, but to be earnest, obviously, and heartfelt in our worship of the Lord. But precious, one thinks what would have been the world's method of celebrating the completion of the walls. No doubt it would have involved wine and alcohol and quite probably getting drunk, but here a holy rejoicing as the Lord's people in one sense do every Lord's Day. And Matthew Henry makes the point, they that sow in tears shall reap in joy. That was hard work, building the walls, rebuilding them with much difficulty, yet ultimately a wonderful, joyful fulfillment of that work. But then going on to chapter 13. 13 is the last chapter of the book, and really is the completion of when Nehemiah returns to Jerusalem, some 12 years after he has gone back to Shushan, to the emperor's court. He finally obtains leave and is able to return to Jerusalem. Verse 6, but in all this time was not I at Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, came I unto the king, and after certain days obtained I leave of the king. He was able to return, but he finds things amiss. 3 principal areas, 3 areas that were dealt with in the covenant that they pledged to keep, to be obedient to the Lord, and 3 areas that they have significantly backslidden on. And so Nehemiah energetically seeks to restore a right worship, a right order amongst the people. And the first is their not being separated from the people of the land, and in particular Eliashib the high priest giving chambers in the temple to Tobiah. They read firstly, that they discover in the law that the Ammonite and the Moabite should not come into the congregation of God forever, because they met not the children of Israel with bread and with water, but hired Balaam against them, that he should curse them. Howbeit our God turned the curse into a blessing. Now, it doesn't mean that folks such as Ruth, who profess the Lord, should not be taken into the congregation of God, but those Ammonites and Moabites, though in one sense cousins to the Israelites, as they were, because it was remembered that it was a grievous thing that they did not meet the children of Israel with bread and water, and also hired Balaam to curse them, though he could not. I won't turn to it now, but a very precious truth that God would not allow Balaam to curse them, and that all the children of God in every age can be assured that they are not under a curse. Christ has borne the curse for us, and though men may act in malice and wickedness against us, yet the Lord will always protect his people, and turned the curse into a blessing. Balaam, as you know, wanted the money, the reward for doing so, but the Lord overruled and would not let him give a curse, but put words of blessing into his mouth. And but the Moabites and the Ammonites were to be excluded. But we find the opposite, that Eliashib, verse 4, the priest having the oversight of the chamber of the house of our God, was allied unto Tobiah, and he had prepared for him a great chamber within the temple, where aforetime they laid the meat offering and so on. Why he had done this, he had prepared a sort of an apartment for Tobiah in the temple. Tobiah should not have been in the temple anyway, as not an Israelite, as an Ammonite, I believe, and yet he is allowed somewhere to live and to stay there. And not only that being wrong, but it stopped the gathering of the tithes. A great chamber where aforetime they laid the meat offerings, the frankincense, and the vessels, and the tithes of the corn, the new wine, and the oil, which was commanded to be given to the Levites, and the singers, and the porters, and the offerings of the priests. And because of that, the Levites had forsaken the work. They had not been given the tithe, and they had to go away and left off the work of the temple. Verse 10, and I perceived that the portions of the Levites had not been given them, for the Levites and the singers that did the work were fled, every one to his field. Then contended I with the rulers and said, why is the house of God forsaken? The very thing that they had pledged in the covenant, and we will not forsake the house of God, they had done in taking this room, big room for Tobiah, no longer to be used to store the tithe. And well, there's all sorts of applications, sadly, today of I saw does the church isn't very wise in who it appoints, and shows kindness and favour to those who are not the Lord's, and have no right in one sense to be in the temple of the Lord. And men go astray following the sort of charismatic false prophets and others, and waste their time and their money in such things, and the church of God as a whole languishes. But the Lord knows, and the Lord has all things in his hand. Why again Eliashib did it, the high priest. No doubt Tobiah was very charming character, but very wrong to what he did. And Nehemiah simply, whilst Tobiah is not there, verse 8, I cast forth all the household stuff of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I commanded, and they cleansed the chambers, and thither brought I again the vessels of the house of God with the meat offering and the frankincense, and commanded the tithe to be brought in, or then it was brought in because there was space there, and he set treasurers over it who were faithful men. And then this prayer that is repeated throughout the chapter, or in some form or another, remember me, O my God, concerning this, and wipe not out my good deeds that I have done for the house of my God, and for the offices thereof. And what is this? Is this him saying, take a note for my merit, so that I will be rewarded, I will be judged favourably as men reckon it, that the Lord has the scales and will, if our good deeds outweigh our bad deeds, we will go to glory? No, because Nehemiah was a justified man, justified by faith alone. But I believe it is more, remember me, O my God, concerning this, and wipe not out my good deeds. Don't let all my work go to nothing. He's been away 12 years. The walls certainly have not crumbled, but the people are departing from what he has brought in and sought to instill with them, and it's as if all his work is being undone. And his great desire that, Lord, please may you uphold this, remember it, and when I am gone, or when I have to return for good to Shushan or wherever, please remember it and wipe not out my good deeds. And it is our great desire, really. We serve the Lord in different ways as the Lord enables. We give and we labour in Sunday school and so on, and it is sad that it seems to make little difference as a whole in the land, but we can pray such a prayer that the Lord would not wipe them out, that the Lord would bless his word and honour, in that sense, vindicate his servant. But then another matter, again mentioned in the covenant, but the keeping of the Sabbath. In those days saw I in Judah some treading winepresses on the Sabbath, and bringing sheaves and lading asses, as also wine, grapes, and figs, and all manner of burdens, which they brought into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. And I testified against them in the day wherein they sold victuals or food. And some there dwelt men of Tyre also therein, which brought fish and all manner of ware, and sold on the Sabbath unto the children of Judah and in Jerusalem, both the traders coming, but also the Jews themselves, bringing in sheaves and lading asses, as also wine, grapes, and so on, all manner of burdens, specifically that they were breaking in a very plain way the command to rest and to keep the Sabbath holy. And he warns them that, verse 18, did not your fathers this thus, and did not our God bring all this evil upon us and upon this city? Yet ye bring more wrath upon Israel by profaning the Sabbath. He contends with them. Verse 17, and I contended with the nobles of Judah, who are obviously responsible, partly responsible, and commands, takes action. Verse 19, that the gates should be shut all the Sabbath day, much as we are now in lockdown, but that the city, the gates would be closed, so the merchants could not come in. And although they stayed a few times, a few Sabbath days outside the city walls, they eventually gave up. And again, the same prayer in verse 22, remember me, O my God, concerning this also, and spare me according to the greatness of thy mercy. We have no trust in our own works, but we do desire that, in one sense, the work of the gospel, what little we have been able to do, would be ultimately honoured and vindicated by the Lord, not for our sakes, but for the Lord's glory, that these things would be seen. And then also, verse 23, a third matter, the marrying of pagan wives again. In those days also I saw I Jews that had married wives of Ashdod, of Ammon, and of Moab, and their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod, and could not speak in the Jews' language, but according to the language of each people. And he is very earnest. One might not quite agree with his exact method. And I contended with them, and cursed them, and smote certain of them, and plucked off their hair, and made them swear by God, saying, Ye shall not give your daughters unto their sons, nor take their daughters unto your sons, or for yourselves. You can understand his grief, because twice now with Ezra, and now before with him, they had agreed not to do so. And yet, in but 12 years, many of them have started to do so again. And it is so easy. Things will inevitably decline and decay without input. The second law of thermodynamics, that every the entropy or the energy in the system inevitably declines without additional input, and it is so in the Lord's work, that unless the Lord revive us, and it's not to put the blame upon the Lord, we and others will inevitably turn away, but we look to the Lord to keep and to bless and to quicken and to uphold his people. It is a solemn matter. He mentions Solomon again, verse 26, did not Solomon, the king of Israel, sin by these things? Yet among many nations was there no king like him, who was beloved of his God. He was called beloved of God, Jedediah, and yet he fell. He was the wisest man, and yet he fell. Nevertheless, even him did outlandish women cause to sin. And how much more did they of that day, and people, men of any day, have cause to be careful and prudent in marrying godly, being equally yoked with Christian godly wives. And even Eliashib again, his family, verse 28, and one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was son-in-law to Sanballat the Horonite. Therefore I chased him from me. And he prays, remember them, O my God, because they have defiled the priesthood, and the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites. Not in one sense necessarily praying for vengeance upon them, but that their example might not prevail, as one might pray against the influence of false teachers, that people would not listen to them, and that the Lord would remember them and stop their wicked influence. And he thus cleansed I them from all strangers, that is, the priests, and appointed the wards of the priests and the Levites, every one in his business. Put them back in what they were to do, and for the wood offering at times appointed, and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. One can imagine him. He has the high priest against him. He has the nobles. He has angered them about the Sabbath. And he has come and rebuked a large part of the population. And he may have been feeling undoubtedly downcast and in a vulnerable situation in one sense. But his confidence is in the Lord, and his prayer to his God, that though he was but one, though he was obviously very powerful, yet that the Lord would uphold and would bless. And the same for us. We are small. The number of believers, and one might say earnest believers in the land, is very small. What can we do, humanly speaking? But we can commit things to the Lord. Remember me, O my God, for good, that the Lord would bless and own his work, and would help and vindicate his people. And we are nothing in one sense in ourselves. Our dependence is on the multitude of his mercy, but the Lord is gracious, and the Lord will remember in one way or another his servants, and will remember and keep and bless what they have sought to do. And obviously it is fulfilled in the inclusion in the canon of this book and the record of his work. But obviously a very capable man, very intelligent, very able as a manager, but yet his dependence is on the Lord, and we can only do so much, or very little in one sense as ourselves, no matter how able we are, but our dependence and looking for blessing is on the Lord, and may he help us and keep us and uphold us as we seek to bear a witness for him. Amen.